Good evening, everyone. It is your girl Marcie joining you from Atlanta, and I'm really excited about this episode of Live Well Sister. The conversation that we're about to have is one that I actually am quite honored to have because we'll be talking about a book that hasn't even made its way out yet. So we're definitely going to be encouraging you to pre-order after you get some insight into what this conversation is about, which is important at any time, but especially right now as we are entering into a political year. And there are just a lot of things that we need to think about in terms of how we advocate for ourselves. So if this is your first time joining, once again, I'm Marcie Thomas, founder of Brown Girl Collective. And this space is really just an important place for us to have conversations about a lot of different things that impact our ability to actually live well in the world. And tonight's conversation is no different. So by means of introduction, our guest is Rahiel Tesfamariam, who is a social activist, journalist, public theologian, and international speaker who has become powerful and a brilliant voice of her generation and offers a bold path to liberation and healing for people of African descent struggling in the shadows of the American dream. And tonight we are honored to talk about her forthcoming book, which will actually be in stores. So please go ahead and pre-order, but it'll be in stores on March the 5th. And it's Imagine Freedom, Transferring Pain into Political and Spiritual Power. And without any further delay, let's welcome Rahiel to the room. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, yes. I'm so honored. As I said in introduction, I'm so honored to have you here. I know you're a busy woman and there's just so many things that you're an active part of. And I consider it an honor that you would have me be one of the first people to discuss the book.
Yes, you are definitely one of the first. Thank you for introducing me to your community. It means a lot to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you have had quite an interesting journey in life, just in general, that even led you to want to write this book. So just tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey, and what led you to really want to dive into this freedom and liberation work.
Well, I always say that I was born into the movement. I was born in East Africa, and I was born during a time of war in Eritrea. And I came to the United States on a 6-month visa for my sister's wedding, which ended up being 19 years before I returned to the continent. I was undocumented for 10 years. And so I talk about how my siblings were freedom fighters in the liberation front to win my country's independence from Ethiopia. And so I grew up hearing them talk about war. I heard them talk about being a political prisoner. Well, that's my brother specifically. And so I didn't know growing up how much of an imprint that had on me, the way in which he normalized revolution, the way in which he normalized freedom fighting, he normalized refugee and immigrant status. And when I began to connect that to the conditions that I was seeing in my local community, growing up in Chocolate City during the crack epidemic, I think all those pieces started to come together for me, that there was something about freedom that mattered a lot to me. And I don't think I could articulate that at a young age. But I was journaling, I was writing poetry about the conditions that I was seeing. And it wasn't until Stanford and being immersed in somewhat of a very Black nationalist community at Stanford and going to the mosque and going to Black churches that I started to kind of get a worldview that I never had before, that made me really look at this in the context of a history of liberation that Black and African and Afro-Indigenous people have been a part of forever.
Yes, and just reading your story, it's very powerful to know from whence you came, so to speak. And even, this isn't giving anything away because, of course, this isn't the type of book that would be spoilers. But just for those who may have not watched before, we're just going to talk about a lot of the themes because the whole thing is for you to buy the book and really dive into it. So, but I found it interesting that you came here for the wedding and you decided you were going to stay.
That's a part of the story. And
Mm-hmm.
my family repeats it to this day. They actually bought the one-way ticket for return because they were like, there's no way that this little 5-year-old girl is not going to go back with her mother, and they're the ones who told me that story, and they've been telling me that story my whole entire life. My brother holds on to that story as a testament to God's imprint on my life. He believes that decision that I made as a young child shows that God had a plan for me that even as a child I couldn't understand, the family couldn't understand, but that it was a decision that was the right one. The course of my life would have been very different had
Right.
I gotten on that plane.
Mm-hmm. And I just love the fact not only did you have the wherewithal or the God sense to know that this is where you needed to be, I really can appreciate the fact that your family supported
Mhm.
you in that choice. Because a lot of parents be like, girl, you better come on here. Like,
Well,
what are you talking
just recently, I didn't know this before. You find out history. And so in writing the book, I found out a lot of things I didn't know before. So one of the things that my brother explained to me is they had the one-way ticket, which I didn't know about, but they'd also made arrangements. And I don't talk about this in the book because, you don't go into that level of detail, but they had made arrangements for me to return with a friend of the family.
about?
Because they were like, okay, this is what she's saying now, but she
Right.
can't really mean this. So the we'll let her stay was with the intention of, okay, when that friend of the family is returning back home, we'll send her back with her, and that never happened.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Love it. I love it. So, you do a lot of work, as a public theologian with speaking, you have a very broad range of things that you do to support your liberation work and your, drive towards freedom. But what was it at this particular point in time in history that drove you to want to write Imagine Freedom?
That's a great question. Well, I have to say that my desire to write this book, one, started when I was a child. I have known I was a writer, and Black educators helped me see that in myself. Black teachers as far back as elementary school, Black women specifically, and I actually mentioned them in my acknowledgments because that was back when the teachers were almost like the mamas, and they cared for you and nurtured you, and so they helped me find my voice. And so I've had this dream, I believe, almost since elementary school.
Wow.
um, but and I think being a journalist and all the work that I've done as a journalist is part of the dream, but the book was not going to leave me. It was always something that I wanted, right? And I think the last maybe 10, 15 years is when I actually started to pursue it. But I say this to encourage anyone who has a dream of writing a book. It's all about timing, right? It's just like a baby. It's just like marriage. It's like anything else that we might pray for. It's all about timing. And you never want to rush it. You never want it to be premature, because there were other books that I thought about writing. There were book deals that I thought about getting, and it was never the right time. And I'm so glad because honestly, I'd have probably been embarrassed if I did
Mhm.
publish those books. I wasn't who I am now. And I think the wealth of experiences I had, like living on the continent,
Mhm.
like becoming a wife, like becoming a mother, the work that I did in particular places, like all of that mattered. And so by the time I'm sitting down and I'm like, what am I going to write? I have the wealth of all those experiences now. I'm not a kid straight out of college. I've been doing organizing work, media work for over 20 years.
Mhm.
Um, and Imagine Freedom, it has many manifestations in my life. There were times I thought I was going to write about fear. There were times I thought I was going to write about trauma. There were so many things I thought I was going to write about. There were even times I thought I was going to write about the American dream. But it
Mm.
got to a point where it was like, well, what does this all boil down to? Right?
Right.
And for me, it was the intersection of freedom and healing.
Mm.
Freedom and healing.
All right. And we're going to get into that a little bit. Now, the book itself, it's broken down into 3 different sections. You start talking about resilience and, the resilience of us as, people of the African diaspora, then the ways in which we resist, and then finally the redemption that's available for us and to us. So I love the way that it's broken down, because it does gave you an opportunity to tap into some of those things that you just mentioned. That it meant the whole book may not have been about X, Y, and Z, but you were able to tap into different pieces of it throughout the book, beginning with the whole thing of what it means to be reclaimed. Now, I found that very interesting because, well, I'll let you talk about it. I don't want to tell the stories for you, but just the fact that oftentimes we can be, as African Americans specifically, we can be people without a country, so to speak, because we don't really belong here, or at least people want to make us feel that we don't belong here, but then we don't have that connection to the motherland. So what is it that, when you talk about reclamation, what is it that you want readers to take away from that part of the book?
Well, first, let me give you all some context. I came to the understanding that I had to write that chapter and start the book with that chapter after living on the continent for 3 years. And I told you I was born on the continent, grew up in the United States, Americanized, but I had the privilege, the honor of living on African soil for 3 years of my life and being immersed in that day in and day out. And so when I'm coming back and I'm writing Imagine Freedom, I'm writing those chapters after that 3-year experience. And so the first thing that was kind of on my mind was the death and rebirth that kind of took place in that experience. The death of the very Americanized way of being that I had in some ways, the individualism, the narcissism. Like there were a lot of ways in which I was moving in the world when I went to the continent, partly also because my career was doing really well. I was being featured in a lot of magazines, and my reach was at that point in the millions in terms of my online magazine, Urban Cuts. I was in a great place. And I went to the continent, walked away from all of that. And it was a death of some sorts to who I thought I was and who I thought God was calling me to be in the world. And I felt that I came back to the United States, and that was a rebirth of the African person that I was born to be, and that I think that I wanted to be. And so I was struggling with, well, how am I going to be this person on American soil now? It's much easier to be that person on the continent, but how am I going to be that person on American soil? And so the idea of reclamation is that rebirth doesn't have to be tied to a land. If we want to claim a personhood that feels more liberating to who we are, a lot of us experience it. I've had friends who go to Costa Rica and sometimes say, I want to move there because I love how I feel when I'm there, right? Well, part of it is, what is it that we think that we've lost that we're fighting so hard to reclaim? And I think individually and collectively, as oppressed people, as Black people and African people, we have to answer that question of what has been lost and what has been stolen. What does the process of reclamation look like for us? There will be some universal aspects that relate to all of us, and then there will be some individual and personal aspects of reclamation. There are some things that I, Rahiel, have to reclaim as an Eritrean woman raised in the Bronx and DC that, you with a different background, a different generation may not have to reclaim,
Yeah, that's something though, because there is the person that maybe we would have been had, and you talk about that, later on, the person that we would have been or could have been had the circumstances of our birth and where we're living, all of that been different, and then being able to kind of straddle the two worlds and figure out how you're going to show up in the space that you actually decide to live. So I really love talking about that, what that means to kind of reclaim yourself.
Yeah. You could look at it in many ways. I think part of it is also reclaiming the part of you that God dreamed of. I think that God has a dream for our lives, and we sometimes stray away from that. It's not just the oppressor and what the oppressor takes from us and what the oppressor forces us to deal with and contend with, and how survival mode changes us and creates adaptations of how we move in the world. It's not just that, but it's also that, that God and the supernatural realm have a deep investment in who we are in the world, and so does the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're reclaiming, as I talk about in Imagine Freedom, is just not the systemic enemy, but it's also spiritual enemies and everything that they've done to try to prevent us from being who God has called us to be. And so reclamation work is not just political, but also spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you said, I'm just thinking of all the people that I know that are probably not walking in their God ordained purpose, and that thing needs to be reclaimed within them. So, thank you for sharing that. And of course, you also talk about trauma because I mean, the reality of it is we all have dealt with trauma in some shape, form, or fashion, whether it's realized or not. And I love that you touch on that because just a few days ago, I was talking to a friend of mine about just some things she's dealing with, and she was like, well, I don't know why I'm reacting this way to this situation. And I was like, well, you do realize that there are things that kind of pass down to you that you may not even be aware of, that it's a part of your DNA, part of your makeup. So just talk a little bit about how we are impacted by trauma, but yet how we can also dive into the healing aspect of that.
Mm. As you were talking, the voice within me said, we are a traumatized people. So even beyond our individual experiences, I mean, there's some of us who have had beautiful upbringings, right? And have had nurturing homes and nurturing families. And I had a friend once say to me, we were the Cosbys, and
Mm-hmm.
and we know what that evokes, right? We're not talking about predatory Bill Cosby. We're talking about,
Right. Yeah, I know. That's why I said,
right,
yeah,
we're
not
talking about the
that part.
Huxtables, right? We're talking about the Huxtables. So a friend who said to me, that was what my family was. My family was not that. We were born into war, and we were separated by political asylum and refugee status and undocumentation. I mean, all the ways in which war ripped our family apart, right? And so there's a trauma that I think is universal to people of color in some ways, because white supremacy has traumatized indigenous people all over the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't get around that. So whether it's us directly or our ancestors, so whether it's me in Eritrea, and the brutality of Italian colonizers and British colonizers, or whether it's people whose families were ripped from the West African shores, we are a traumatized people. So I think one, acknowledging that, and that's kind of where the universality of being Black is
Right.
in many ways in trauma, unfortunately. But then there's also that personal and individual trauma that that sometimes goes unnamed. That we normalize trauma in our communities. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
sometimes we see certain behavior, we see certain conditions, and all of it is all we know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it takes that deep learning and therapy and all of that to kind of pull back the veil that we've been looking through our entire lives, and then we begin to see, oh, that wasn't normal.
Right.
It wasn't supposed to be like that.
Right.
And there were a lot of people who didn't grow up like that and didn't have those experiences. So I think part of the healing journey is, first and foremost, as I talk about, naming. You
Right.
know, one of the first entry points into being healed is being able to name something happened.
Right.
And we've heard the trauma question asked over and over again. It's not about what's wrong with you; it's about what happened to you.
Right.
So I think that part of the healing journey is that question of what happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think Oprah has a book with someone else
Mhm.
about
Yep.
what happened to you. Because there are different things that we have gone through, whether, as you said, collectively or individually. And, just being able to deal with that, to heal and, to move forward, hopefully, in a way that allows us to experience love and joy and freedom and all of these other things. So, but as you said, we can't conquer what we won't confront. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people talk about, Oprah as an example. People talk about Steve Jobs, people talk about their success. People talk about what became of their lives, and people don't talk about the trauma they
Right.
endured, right? So think about the, myth making in America. When we talk about the American dream, we focus on who the person became, what they did, and we overshadow what they went through.
Right.
Right? Because the manifestation of their dream celebrates America and says, see what America can do for you. But by ignoring and silencing the trauma that those people went through, I mean, my understanding of Steve Jobs is that he grew up without his mother. He was adopted, and that emptiness of not having his mother deeply affected him. And we know Oprah's story. We know Maya Angelou's story. I mean, we know all these stories of deep, deep, deep trauma. But in some ways, America fast forwards to the celebration of them actualizing the American dream without talking about the hell that they went through growing up. And because that hell is a reflection of what's waiting for us and the reality of what it's like to grow up in this country with poverty, because a lot of their trauma was also connected to poverty.
Right.
Right? Poverty and sometimes, stigmas about who can and cannot have children. So all of that is the pain of being American in many ways that we don't talk about.
I just have a comment. Most only see the end result, but don't see the trials that come with success. Absolutely, absolutely. And you already mentioned the American dream, so that's a good segue into the next question that I had, as well as another section of the book. But the whole way that the American dream is tied to capitalism. And what that really looks like, especially for us as people of African descent living here in this nation, that it was built on our backs. Capitalism and all of that is is the only reason why they really wanted us here to begin with. And so how that plays out in a modern time is we're striving to work towards the American dream, but what that really means and what we're looking to gain, but what we lose in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a very interesting relationship with capitalism. We do. I mean, in many ways, we deserve everything America has to offer. We deserve it. That let's just say that we deserve it. We deserve the homes, we deserve the cars, we deserve the land, right? Because we have yet to get reparations. Let's start there, right? So it's not like the country ever gave back to us what was rightfully ours. And when I say us, I mean people of African descent on this soil. It has never happened. Has it really ever happened for indigenous people, in terms of Native Americans? So this country is not at all good at making right their wrongs. So in many ways, we have individually and collectively had to make up for what America refuses to do. And so that's where I think we have to offer our people grace, right? Because I don't want to ever come off as judgmental that our pursuits of dreams and our pursuits of achievement and success are wrong. We have a right to joy. We have a right to success. We have a right to everything that they have denied us. And you know what? Generational wealth, which is something I mentioned, is something that they've been able to build on our backs, right? So for all those reasons, we deserve what we've been deprived of. But the flip side of it is to never ignore the relationship between white supremacy and capitalism. Never ignore the relationship between capitalism and Black exploitation. Never ignore the relationship between capitalism and institutionalized slavery. And I think once you start making those connections, or how capitalism continues to inflict harm and trauma on masses of people all over the world today, once those connections begin to be made, then your relationship with capitalism will be forced to change unless you're going to intentionally claim ignorance.
Oh, yes, have a comment. The revolution we want is in our hands. We will never get it from those who have never stood on justice, freedom, and equality. Yep, but it is a thing to think about because as you mentioned, I have certain goals and aspirations and things that I want to do. We talk about and you mentioned in your book like rest, being able to rest, how rest is resistance, and how I want to live a soft life and all these things. So those are things that I desire, but at the same time, I do have certain goals, a certain lifestyle, and it does become a thing of can I do those things that I want and still maintain a sense of who I am and not lose myself trying to make someone else successful at the risk of my own health and well-being.
What you just said is very important, right? So what you just said acknowledges the fact that oftentimes what we think we're doing for ourselves is actually enriching the life of someone else and enriching their life 100 times more than it will ever enrich ours, right? And some of us don't necessarily labor with our hands anymore. You have poor and working class people who are literally laboring with their hands. A lot of us are able, to work. I talk about this in a book, remotely. A lot of us, are in front of a computer all day. Exactly, right? That's a
Mhm.
different kind of existence, and in the communities that I've been part of, the movement spaces I've been a part of on the continent, we talked about the difference between intellectual work and labor that requires us to toil, right?
Mhm.
And how we should see value in both,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
You see value in both. So the same value we put in quote unquote intellectual work is the same value that we got to put into somebody, serving as a janitor or a housekeeper or whatever it might be. That all of this is labor, and labor is valuable and requires skill and talent. But what is important is to know that the billionaires of the world, the millionaires of the world, who control what they call the means of production, are
Hmm.
going to benefit in ways that we never will.
Right.
And that's where we don't buy into delusions how
Mm-hmm.
successful we are, because in many ways we are still being controlled by someone else.
Mm-hmm. And I also like that you talk about in the book the kind of the false narrative that we may have of seeing certain people, Black people specifically,
Mhm.
becoming millionaires and billionaires in certain fields, oftentimes sports and entertainment. I mean, just call
Yep.
it thing to thing.
Mhm.
And so people look at them as these,
Yep.
exceptional people who have made it. And so they assign that, oh, things are, okay because look at these.
Doing good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
look at these people doing good, but ignore all of the people who will never see any level of financial success in that regard.
Yeah. So the distinction I'm making when I write about that, right, is the difference between what they call the trappings of success, right? So, the outer appearance of success versus real power, real power. And so, you know, there are many of us who might get to a millionaire status. Now we know there's some of us who are going to get to a billionaire status, right? But are any of those people able to stop our people from being killed? Are they able to, change laws? Are they able to stop a genocide from taking place? I mean, where does the power rest?
Right,
Right? And so much of our focus is on the outer appearance of success. And I'm like, but that success can't save our people from
right,
dying, from being brutalized, and from no one not being held accountable for our oppression, right? And we have to shift our obsession with material success to a real understanding of what power means, because white supremacy is not giving up power. They're
right,
not. They're not giving up power. And you can see it in the news. It's in the headlines. You can't deny it. They are not relinquishing power. But they will, what you call trickle down economics or
mhm,
crumbs from the master's table, whatever you want to call it. They will offer that. But when
mm,
it comes time to power, that's when they let you know you don't have a seat at the table.
right. And I mean, we've seen that play out recently with some things that happened in academia. You know how, yeah, you have this title, you have this role, but you don't have any power, and we're gonna quickly either snatch it away from you, or make you so uncomfortable that you decide you don't want to be a part of it at all. So
Right.
yeah, so that's just one example of things that we see. But I love it because you're saying things that are leading into the next question, which I love, because you mentioned the media. And of course, we know that the media is a very powerful engine, that, mainstream media that puts out all types of stories, and they frame us as Black people, whether it's here, in the US, or, a few years ago, we had someone whose name I won't mention calling African nations or Black nations shithole countries, things like that. There is this whole thing that the media does and buys into, that tries to define us. And, you've been a part of the media for many years
Yeah.
and all of that. So just talk a little bit about how media impacts us and what we can do to make sure that we are keeping our voices at the forefront in whatever ways we possibly can.
Yeah, I have been a part of the media because I understand its power. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and a large part of my history is with grassroots media, Black owned publications in communities that otherwise would not have their stories told. I've started my own grassroots media outlet, and I've also been a part of the mainstream as a former columnist for the Washington Post. And so I've seen both sides. I've been on both sides. I know the benefits and drawbacks of both worlds, and I think when it comes to media, we have to understand that the control of the mind is the real war. The control of the mind. And Carter G. Woodson talked about this. If
Mm-hmm.
you can control a man's, as he said, a man or a person's way of thinking, if you can control that, you no longer have to tell them what to do to be oppressed. They will instinctively do that themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So media is powerful because media controls how we see the world, how we think, and how we move in the world. So it gets to the point that the oppressor no longer has to enslave us, no longer has to colonize us. The oppressor simply has to control how we think.
Mm-hmm.
So if we begin to see European standards of beauty as beautiful, then we're oppressed because we don't hold a high esteem of ourselves and our people, and then become, walking vessels of internalized self-hatred, right? So there are all the ways in which media is an extension of white supremacy, an arm of white supremacy. It's
Mm-hmm.
also very powerful in mobilizing us, and many people have engaged in activism solely through social media, right? So I don't ever want to devalue it because I've used it. I've used it for protest. I've used, when Trayvon Martin was killed, when Mike Brown was killed, I used the media because I knew it was the most powerful tool at the time, right? So a lot of these things are not an either or, they're a both and, right?
Right.
We can participate in media and be critical of it. We can utilize media for activist purposes and acknowledge that it's a tool of oppression and white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be a either or, black and white. We can live in the both and.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you say that, because I mean, there is power in being able to, what should I say, know what's happening in the world around you, whether it's, locally or globally. There is power in that, but also being aware, of the powers that be, and, being a person that is a student of life, and, doesn't necessarily always look to one source for all of your information, understanding that there are different biases and things that play in to media and all of that. And I really love in the book you talk about, a lot of the different ways that Black people such as yourself have, started media, thinking back to like the Ebonies and the Essens and the Jets of the world, and, all of the Black newspapers and things like that are allowing folk that have allowed historically folks to have a voice. And then of course this digital space, because I consider this here is media.
Yeah, you're doing it. You're doing
Right.
it. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, so part of it is creation. Part of it is saying what exists today does not represent the full scope of who we are as a people, and they will never be able to tell our stories the way that we can. And so, and when I say they, it's whatever indigenous community we're talking about. Oftentimes there's a colonizer that has told the story for them, you know, and that's why I talk about media as a tale of the hunt, right? There will always be a hunter and the hunted, and oftentimes the story's told from the vantage point of the hunter, and so media will tell you the history of the hunter. Why did the hunter do what he did? Why was he out there, willing to kill and prey on this thing, right? And so it humanizes the hunter. So you're reading the story solely focused on the hunter, their emotions, their conditions, their background. And it's the same exact thing that happens when a young Black person is killed by a police officer. And we're hearing about their story, their wife, their narrative, and all of a sudden the victim is a drug dealing gangbanger, who's high and just stole something from a store a few minutes ago, or wasn't just going to get some iced tea and Skittles, but was this, monster that had to be killed, right? So everything is told from the vantage point of the hunter. And what we forget is that we're the ones who've always been preyed on.
Right.
And so the role of media is to shift the focus, not from glorifying the hunter, but talking about the pain and suffering of those who were hunted. And that's us. That's us. That's us.
That is so powerful. And I mean, it shows up in a whole lot of ways, whether it's, the things that you mentioned, the young men who are, murdered, by the state, or vigilantes, as you say, and thinking about the ways that in which Black women are treated, the stories that are told, like you have a Black woman that's missing and that information doesn't make it out because we're not seen as important. I mean, it just shows up in a whole lot of ways of how the stories that the media tells and the ways that they would oftentimes would rather paint us in a negative light versus showing our true humanity, and that there's equality of of all of who we are, no matter what your color or gender or sexual orientation, all of those things, that there is just a humanity that exists among all of us, but the media has a way of coloring certain things to share the narrative that they want to be seen. So
right, which again is often tied to capitalism, that they have interest, and those interests are often corporate. Money moves the world, unfortunately, not necessarily values, not necessarily a passion for humanity and a commitment. No, it's money. And so their corporate interests drive what they show on television and don't show on television. And oftentimes they got people pulling their strings. They're puppets. It's not to suggest that they have real power. No, they're puppets, right? Oftentimes the media is just responding to what they know or what they think they have to do. And part of it is going back to this idea of a matrix, right? We're all caught up in a matrix of everyone doing what they think is the only way, right? So if the media has always told the story from that of the hunter, from the vantage point of the hunter, the media begins to say, well, that's the only way we can do it because it's what's always been done. We have to do what's always been done, right? And then that just becomes justification for our subjugation and our oppression. And so that's where we have to say, one, we're either going to create what's needed because you're not doing it, or two, we're going to call you out on your mess.
Right.
We're going to call you out on your mess. And I see that happening now, and it's really encouraging.
It is. It is. One last thing in this whole media space before we move on, because you talked about our music, specifically hip hop, because hip hop just turned 50 last year. So even though we still have other forms of music, hip hop is, very a global sensation, and how, it's changed over the years, and that the messages that are being, shared have changed a lot over the years, and how you have media companies or record companies and who gets greenlit and who gets to be seen and what types of messages are we hearing. Even that is something that is strategic.
Yeah. I mean, there's this story I tell about Nipsey Hussle doing this interview where he talks about a parallel between hip hop and and Africa being colonized, and he draws that parallel between, and he doesn't ever say, flat out that like, um, he doesn't necessarily make the obvious connections, but for me, it's like, wow, he's talking about natural resources. He's
Mm-hmm.
talking about colonization. He's talking about hip hop, and he's talking about what's indigenous to us, and that's the stories and the pain and stuff. I mean, it was just this brilliant, brilliant analogy, which I never heard in the mainstream, which
Mm-hmm.
I had to find and dig up and research, and it was
Wow.
like I got to share it with the world myself because as much as I'd read about him and studied him, they never shared that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think it's a powerful message that we need to walk with today about what has happened to hip hop. How did it lose its indigenous roots? Right? How did it forget its true identity? And it's the same relearning and unlearning that Africa or any colonized um, community has ever had to do. Right? That the oppressor comes, the oppressor steals and snatches your natural resources, exploits it and uses it for its own gain to the point that you can't even recognize it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Can't even recognize it. And oftentimes we'll say, we'll let you have it back, but you gotta pay for it, right?
Mm.
And so that's what they've done with hip hop, just like they did anything else, right? Come steal your stuff and then tell you the only way you can get it back is by paying for it, right?
Mm.
So we gotta pay you to share our stories and to not even hear our stories the way that they, ought to be told, but hear them in this distorted, misogynistic, materialistic way that actually benefits you,
Right.
right? Right? And benefits your exploitation of us. You gotta be kidding me.
Mm. I'm just like,
Mm, yeah.
whew. Yeah, that's deep and so true. Thank you. I just had to bring that out because that is so true. Now, of course, you talk about movement building and ways that we can uprise. So that's one of the other chapters. But we have only 15 minutes left. Can you believe that? This has
I
been
know
such
we
a
could
great
stay on
conversation. And
forever.
I
Yeah.
knew we wouldn't get to everything, but I do want to talk about solidarity, though, because that is so important. Pan Africanism and solidarity is just important for us to understand how we can come together as members of the diaspora. Because oftentimes you'll hear things about, a Black American is this, or Africans are that, or, people from the Caribbean are this. And there's so many ways in which we people have attempted, colonizers, white supremacists have attempted to tear us apart. But what is the value in us being able to come together?
Well, let's first acknowledge that our separation is to the benefit of the oppressor. And I go back to, the Garden of Eden, that God said our oneness, our humanity, our unity was good and important. Man cannot be alone, right? And therefore was the need for one man. So humanity is birth, community is birth. And what does the enemy, meaning Satan, come and do? Satan comes and says, I'm going to create divide between you all. I'm going to divide you. I'm going to tell you that, not only between you and your lover, but you and your God.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what I'm saying is let's go back to the Garden of Eden and the first tool of the enemy being one of division. And that division became generational, with Cain, the children of Adam and Eve, right? So you have a brother killing a brother. So now it's a generational cycle of division and bloodshed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say for Africa and Black America, it benefits the enemy. And when I say the enemy, I mean any oppressive force for
Right.
us to be divided. And if we're being real, the oppressive forces have often been European countries and America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they benefit by us not uniting. In the context of Africa, would there be value in one currency that unified all of Africa like the European Union? Yes, but that's something that still hasn't happened to today and is debated. If it does happen, then Africa becomes a viable threat in some ways, right? But
Mhm.
yeah, as long as you have all these weak currencies floating throughout Africa, like Zimbabwe, where the money is kind of given out almost as a souvenir, right?
Wow.
Europe benefits from this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so our unity, sadly, has often been tied to culture.
Mm.
We appreciate each other's culture. We love each other's culture. Where you'll have the interchange of music and clothing and hairstyles and dance moves, and we have celebrated one another's cultures almost sometimes to the point of appropriation, because we're taking pieces of the culture both ways without any political knowledge, any historical knowledge, any communal knowledge, right? So
Right.
we have to have ties to each other that go beyond culture.
Mm-hmm.
Those ties should be political, they should be spiritual. And our people have always done that. You have people, groups of our people, meaning Black Americans, traveling to African soil, trying
Right.
to reconnect with Africa. um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's always been a both and of the sharing and the giving of history and struggle, right? But I think there's more that we can do to unify our struggles. If we begin to see that we are all fighting very similar enemies, that
Mm-hmm.
we have histories that have knitted us together, and you got East Africans, seeing themselves different from West Africans because of complexion. You got the Rwandan genocide where people in one country, I mean, so you have all these ways in which we've been warring, oftentimes, sadly, over who looks most like them,
Mm.
right? Like we've been killing each other and hating each other in this struggle of who looks and moves and acts like them, our oppressor, right? And it's not to put white folks under this umbrella of enemy, oppressor, but it's to say that there is a real history that we cannot ignore of
Right.
European colonizers coming to African soil, and stripping the people in the land. The scramble for Africa is real, right? And Africa is still suffering because of the scramble for Africa, right? Black America is still suffering because of the ships that came from African soil to the colonies of America, right? So we can't deny centuries of history, nor can we deny what's still happening today,
Right.
right? The indebtedness, uh, the ways in which they have their hand on African politics through coups and, through the assassinations of African leaders. I mean, all kinds of ways, right? It's unbelievable what's happening and what has happened. And as long as we're divided, it will continue to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's just something that's food for thought. Once again, get all of it. Dive into the book when it comes out. But
A lot in that book. One thing I
there is a lot, and that's what I said. We are only scratching the surface, everybody.
we
So
ain't even give nothing away. I mean, it's
yeah, without giving anything, and as you told me, it's been updated to add some things that are more current. So I'm like, wow, yes, but just from the perspective of in the last section of the book, you talk a lot about our redemption, because I mean these are a lot of heavy topics and things that we have to deal with and navigate through, and heal from all of that. Come up with new ways to circumvent the media and all those sorts of things. But I love how you talk about that there is power in self-determination. Now, what do you mean by that for those who may wonder
yeah,
what
power
that
and
means?
determination. A lot of us have never read UN charters. A lot of us don't know why the UN was established. We don't see the UN as relevant to our history. But
Mhm.
when we look at African countries fighting colonial powers, all of that was tied to decisions and policies that were directly tied to the UN, right? And one thing that was very clear was this question of self-determination had to be figured out, right? Did colonized people have a right to self-determination? You could say in many ways, America had that same question of, did enslaved Africans have a right to self-determination? The right to education, the right to be able to own land, the right to elect your own political officials. I mean, the right to decide your own destiny.
Right.
Right. And it's an important question. It's the question that lingers over this issue of Israel and Palestine. It is a question of self-determination. So we're not talking about something limited to the 60s.
Right.
We're talking about something that is very real and very present. Puerto Rico being, still a colony of the United States. I mean, there are all these ways in which self-determination, Haiti and all the ways in which Haiti's still seeking self-determination, and Black Americans.
Right.
Who are seeking self-determination, and the fact that we don't necessarily have a political party that reflects our interests. Right. Because you could try to argue it's the Democrats, but you could also try to argue that we have a government that protects us. But then again, you have all these non-indictments, right? So there's all these ways in which we're very clear that we don't really have self-determination. We have a facade of many things, including, as I talk about, facade of freedom, right? And so I think, should explore true self-determination. And many of our elders and ancestors have dealt with that in the past when they said, hey, we need our own land.
Right.
And talked about claiming African land for Black people, right? There have been those of us who said, we need our own leadership, and they've developed their own political parties. I mean, let's not forget it was the Black Panther Party, right? So there are all these ways in which our people have sought to see self-determination. I think Black Panther parties is one of the greatest examples, because what they did was say, we're not going to depend on the government. We're going to feed our kids. We're going to house our people. We're going to provide medical services. And we see what the government did. It wasn't like the government said, oh, thank you for taking a burden off of us.
Right. No, you can't do that.
They killed Fred Hampton, right? Yeah. So what is it about our self-determination that's such a huge threat to the government that they would assassinate a 20-something-year-old leader like Fred Hampton because they would see him as the Black Messiah who runs the threat of saving Black people, right? So for some reason, the U.S. government understands how important self-determination is to us. So I think it's important for us, especially as millennials, Gen Z, the generations of the future, to explore what self-determination means for Black people today.
And you differentiate self-determination from self-advancement or quote unquote Black excellence.
Because I think that self-determination, first of all, has to go beyond self. We don't want to focus on a type of self-determination that is individualistic and then just, repeats everything that capitalism is, right? I mean, it's a self-determination that is also communal. It's communities of people being able to determine their future and their destinies, right? It's countries, it's nations, like African nations, like Palestine, not just individuals, so it's not just you and I having that house and that car, which is why I draw that distinction between Black excellence, because, I'm gonna be real. There was a time that, I'm not going to name the artist, but there was a time in which a very well-known Black celebrity posted a picture, of him toasting with these other Black celebrities, and they were all millionaires. They were all filthy rich. And the caption was Black excellence. And I remember I wrote something in response to that. What I wrote went viral, right? And it went viral because I think it resonated with people. My point was, we don't want capitalism masquerading as the promised land. Okay, if our quest has always been the promised land, biblical, throughout Black history, the promised land. What is Black people's promised land? Let's not confuse it with capitalism. Let's not confuse it with wealth, and so basically let's know that liberation for us does not mean that we get everything the oppressor has. Right? And that's why I struggle with this idea. So liberation can't be, I want what they have, and so my mentor always reminds me of integrationists versus nationalists. And the idea was integrationists said, We just want to go to your schools. We want to be at your jobs. We want everything you have, right? I mean, and I don't mean to belittle it, but
Right.
it was give us access, right?
Right.
But I think, there's another school of thought that says, wait a minute, there's a history that shows the hunter cannot be trusted. So do I really want to be everywhere where the hunter is?
Woo.
Or do I need safe space?
Safe space.
Safe space. I need safe space. And that gets tough because we want allyship. We want to be comrades with all people. If you share our values, especially working class and poor people, let's unite around our struggles. But at the same time, there's a history of exploitation. There's a history of traumatization. And if that's the case, what do we need to create a better, safer world for us? Mm-hmm. And it may not look anything like what the oppressor values.
Y'all, you hear this? A lot to think about. Well, we are almost at time, but I cannot end without talking about love, just because, there's some other things that the book covers, but let's talk about the love revolution, or the revolution of love, and how important that is for just us as a people.
Well, so I'm glad, we're ending with this, because a lot of times, people will say, this is not going to relate to me because I'm not an activist. I'm not a political person. That's not my thing. I don't really deal with that. Right. And the reality is we all want to be free, and whatever freedom means to us. Some of us want to be able to freely love, and when I say freely love, I don't even mean loving someone of the same sex. I don't even necessarily mean that. Freely love might be that I want to be in a place where the harm that has been done to me, personal, systemic, is no longer affecting my relationships with people. Because your oppression don't have to be systemic. Your oppression can be that you're bound to the past. Your oppression can be that you're unforgiving. Your oppression can be that you're angry and you can't let go of the bitterness. Your oppression can be that you don't trust someone, so much so that somebody trying to love you and you won't even let them love you. Like, there are multiple ways in which you can be oppressed in your own body, which is why I quote the Me Too movement in the chapter about trauma and healing to say, the first site of liberation is the body, right? And so when we talk about love, and we talk about love as the forgotten revolution, and we talk about revolutionary love, all the things that I talk about, it's about us healing our bodies of the trauma that our bodies have undergone, especially women. Especially women, all the stories that women hold of the ways they were taken advantage of when they were little, and they carry that, and they haven't healed their inner child. So the grown woman don't know how to love because the inner child hurting, right?
She's like, oh, girl.
I'm not gonna tell y'all no lies. No,
right?
Right? If you want the truth, you can talk to me. So there's all these ways, and we don't necessarily want to use the language of brokenness, right? Because that's the language that has been used to make us think that we're not good enough, right. That we're not equipped to be at the table because we're so broken and damaged, right? And it's like, no, that's not true, because I might need to undo some of the harm you've done to me, right. But at my core, I'm not broken. And so when we talk about love, what we're talking about is oppressed people coming together and loving one another in spite of all the things that have historically been done to rip us apart. And when we begin to see love as our resistance to the enemy, earthly and spiritual, it shifts how we move in relationships. When we begin to say that the enemy, being, white supremacy and Satan, have attacked the Black family, that will, I hope, hold Black men accountable to moving differently in relationships and treating Black women differently than they might if they begin to understand that the enemy has a vested interest in them tearing up their homes. That the enemy has a vested interest in us not trusting the Black man and not wanting to be with him and not doing right by him. So the more we're divided, the more the enemy benefits, which is why we must love each other fiercely.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, that's a word. And you are a theologian as well. So she just gave us a word. Wow. This is so wonderful, Rahel. And I'm so glad that you were able to come and give us a preview, just a preview, because we did not hit everything as I knew we wouldn't. But Imagine Freedom is it's powerful, it's necessary, just for us to really think about some things in a way that maybe we haven't thought about it before, whether it's how we connect within ourselves, how we heal, how we deal with others in our community, how we the programs that we develop, or all of those things.
All
It's
those things.
all encompassed in this, and how we can begin to truly imagine what freedom looks like, to truly see that and live well, because of course this is called Live Well.
Yes.
All of those things, so this is such an important work. It will be out on March the 5th, so you can still continue to go about the process of pre-ordering. And just a little plug,
Yes.
the Brown Girl Collective Bookstore does have the book available there as well. It's browngirlcollectivebookstore.com. It is affiliated with Bookshop, so if you go there, you can find that book amongst others. And I do know that pre-orders are very important for
Yes, they
authors.
are.
So if you can order, whether it's from me or go to your local bookstore or wherever you purchase books online, please do that, because the pre-orders go towards the first week of sales and things like that. So it's very important for an author. So of course you've had the opportunity to be with us about 7 weeks out.
Yes.
Someone's saying we'll definitely be ordering this book. Yes, please
Thank
do.
you. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. So I know you've got a few weeks before it comes out. Are there any particular events that people can be on the lookout for if they follow you, either on social media or through your website?
Yes, definitely follow me on social media, as I will be announcing all the upcoming events. I will, of course, be doing interviews leading up to it, but the majority of what I'll be doing leading up to it will be virtual. But come March, I want to see you all in person and connect and have, dialogue. So follow Rahiel T, Rahielt, and then my website, rahel.com, has, all the information you need about Imagine Freedom, about me and what I'm doing. And I'd love to see you all at your churches, your libraries, your bookstores, because at the end of the day, I'm a minister, and I love people and I love connecting with people. So what will mean so much to me is to begin to hear what Imagine Freedom means to you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I already told you, you make it to Atlanta, we definitely will connect and all of that, because I think that what you're doing is so powerful. And I know that there's so much more, than even what's in the book, just who you are as a person, a citizen of this world. And I really, again, I appreciate you trusting me in this space, be able to help, be one of the ones to announce this wonderful work to the world. So
Thank you.
everybody, that is what we have for this evening. Please go ahead and grab your copies and all of that. Just a real quick announcement, Rahiel, I'm going to let you go for a second so you can grab some water or whatever, and I'm just going to announce next week's book. So
Okay.
thank you again, but don't hang up yet.
Okay.
Hold on for a second. All right. That was such a wonderful and powerful conversation that I'm glad and blessed that I had an opportunity to have. So for next week, normally it's like a Live Well show, but it's actually going to be a second BGC book club. We're having two next week, one on Monday and then one on Wednesday. We're going to dive even further into some of the global thought leaders, and we'll be talking about Black voices, inspiring and empowering quotes from global thought leaders. So we're going to continue to talk about Pan-Africanism and what that means, and hear from some of the voices of people that are powerful from around the world. So you can see this is a beautiful book, beautiful illustrations, a lot of nice quotes, information about the people who wrote the quotes and things like that. So that's what we'll be diving into next week, Black voices, as we lead into Black History Month. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for your time and being here. I appreciate you. Please buy the book. I'll throw the name up one more time. Go ahead and buy the book. And please continue to support all these wonderful authors that show up in this space. And let's do the doggone thing and continue to live well. And look forward to seeing you again here real soon. Take care.